By royal decree, bring forth the woman of the hidden valley at once. A booming voice echoed through the deep forested glen.
Freedom is our right.
The royal carriage of King Edward had come to a halt before a ruined, thatched cottage. A woman with dirt-stained hands, clutching a woven basket of wild herbs, stared blankly at the sight. She was a woman who had lived for 15 years, cast aside, pointed at, and mocked as a crazy herb gatherer. But this woman was no ordinary gatherer of weeds. She was the brilliant daughter and sole apprentice of the late royal physician. 15 years ago, she had secretly accompanied her father to the royal chambers and instantly identified the illness of the late Queen Mother. Eleanor, an ailment no other physician could cure, using but a single rare root dug from the crags. When her father was murdered and the village folk sneered and called her mad, a fiercely loyal old man, sharing not a drop of blood with her, had taken her in and protected her for 15 long years. What secret was truly hidden within this woman? And for what reason had King Edward himself journeyed all the way to this remote, forgotten valley? Gather around the hearth, travelers, and listen closely so this tale may live on. Let us begin this heart-stirring tale of old.
Once upon a time, during the reign of King Edward, there lay a small medieval village known as Coldwater Glen.
Tucked away in the deep, shadowy valleys of the cragged mountains, at the very edge of the valley, on a steep, wind-swept slope, stood a crumbling timber and thatch cottage in lonely isolation. In that cottage lived a woman named Hazel. She was 38 years of age, a time when a woman might normally live comfortably as the mistress of a manor. Yet Hazel's face was forever smudged with earth and ash. Every morning, at the break of dawn, Hazel would climb the mountain without fail. With the clink and clack of her iron herb shears, she roamed the deep woods. Bitterweed, wild angelica, ground ivy, and kingsfoil. Plants that the commoners of the world merely called useless weeds, became precious medicine the moment they met Hazel's hands. By the time her frayed linen sack was heavy and full of harvested roots and leaves, the sun would already be high in the sky. There comes the crazy herb gatherer down from the mountain again. The village women would gossip, hiding their mouths beneath their wool coifs as they gathered near the muddy market square. A perfectly healthy woman, unmarried, living in the wild woods, pulling weeds. She must be mad or cursed. They say she wandered in 15 years ago from God knows where. No woman buries herself in the wild without a dark past. Hazel heard every word, yet she kept her head bowed and walked past them as if she were deaf to their whispers. She simply carried her heavy sack of herbs in silence and returned to her cottage. The village folk did not know. They did not know that one wall of Hazel's cottage was strung with drying herbs, tended to with the utmost care, and that the other wall was covered in dozens of sealed parchments detailing the complex medicinal secrets her father had taught her. Then came a bitter, freezing winter day. Braving the heavy, blinding snow, a desperate woman pounded on the heavy oak door of Hazel's cottage.
"Please, open the door! My boy, my Tom, he is dying! His feet have turned black as coal!"
Flinging the door open, Hazel saw a young village boy of about 7 or 8 years old, wrapped tightly in a woolen blanket. He had suffered severe frostbite, and his feet were blackened and dying. The mother, Cora, wept that the greedy village healer had turned them away, demanding silver she did not have, and claiming the boy was beyond saving. Grasping at straws, Cora had braved the storm to seek out the crazy herb gatherer of the woods. Hazel brought the boy into her warm hearth room without a single word. From an iron cauldron bubbling over the fire, she scooped a pre-brewed medicinal water and carefully, gently washed the boy's blackened feet. Next, Hazel took a handful of dried yellow roots from a wooden shelf and ground them into a fine powder. She mixed the crushed herbs with warm oil, creating a thick poultice, and pressed it firmly all over Tom's feet. She did this for 3 days and 3 nights. "Mother, I can feel my toes again." On the morning of the 4th day, the boy spoke his first words since the ordeal began. Cora collapsed to the dirt floor right then and there, weeping loudly in sheer relief. "Thank you."
Oh, God bless you. Thank you. How many silver pennies do I owe you? How can I repay this?
Hazel gently shook her head. "No payment is needed. Just see that the boy grows up strong and healthy. That is reward enough for me." At those words, the mother fell to her knees once more in gratitude. Yet, when Cora returned to the village and told her tale, the people refused to believe her. They called it a fluke of nature. A madwoman of the woods could not possibly possess the skill to save a dying limb, they said. About 100 paces away from Hazel's cottage, further up the mountain path, stood another dilapidated timber hut. There lived an old woodcutter named Bram. He was 72 years old, an old man with a stooped back and hair as white as the winter snow. The villagers considered Bram to be nothing more than Hazel's old servant. They pointed fingers, claiming the two of them were in league, practicing strange witchcraft in the woods. But the people did not know. They did not know that every single day, before the sun rose, Bram quietly circled Hazel's cottage, checking for footprints and listening for any sign of danger. They did not know about the finely forged castle broadsword buried deep beneath the floorboards of Bram's hut. Nor did they know that Bram was once a fierce and loyal royal guard who served Hazel's late father. "Milady Hazel, are you safe this night?" Every evening, Bram would check the hearth fire in front of Hazel's cottage, toss that single question into the cold air, and turn back. "Yes, Bram, my old friend, I am safe today." That was the unchanging exchange of greetings the two had shared for 15 long years. The seasons turned, and spring arrived. But with the thaw came a terrifying plague that swept through Coldwater Glen. Adults and children alike burned with raging fevers, violently vomiting and suffering from sickness of the bowels. The greedy village healer did not know the name of the foul disease and merely stamped his feet in helplessness. In 3 days, 5 people took to their sickbeds, and in 5 days, 12 people were knocking on death's door. It was then that Hazel came down to the village square, a heavy sack slung over her shoulder. "This is a brew made of willow bark, arrowroot, and skullcap. You must have every sick soul drink 1 wooden bowl of this." Thomas, a desperate father with great influence in the village council, initially stared into the dark, bitter-smelling wooden bowl with deep suspicion. But with his own son lying near death, what choice did a father have? Thomas forced the brew down his son's throat. Miraculously, within half a day, the boy's fever broke. The rumor spread like wildfire. The village folk flocked to Hazel, begging for the medicine. Hazel did not sleep for 3 days and 3 nights, brewing the cure without rest. From her bubbling iron cauldrons, the earthy, bitter scent of medicinal herbs rose into the air without pause. Beside her, Bram silently chopped firewood and hauled heavy buckets of water from the stream. At dawn on the 6th day, the last patient rose from his bed. The village had been saved. That night, Bram walked into Hazel's cottage, carrying a few hot, roasted root vegetables wrapped in a cloth. Hazel was nodding off, sitting right in front of her empty cauldron. "Milady, please eat something. You haven't had a single bite of food in 3 days." Bram offered the steaming roasted roots with both hands. Hazel groggily opened her eyes and took them. The warm heat spread through her cold palms. "You must eat with me, Bram." The two of them sat beneath the dim light of a tallow candle, breaking the roasted roots apart and sharing them. After eating in silence for a long while, Bram finally spoke. "Milady, I believe it is time you revealed your true identity to the world. 15 years. 15 years in exile is surely enough." Hazel quietly looked at Bram, a piece of food still in her mouth. "Bram, the life I knew died in the royal castle. My father was murdered in the capital, and with him, my place in the court. The bright young apprentice of the past no longer exists in this world. But Hazel, the woman who lives in these woods picking herbs, that is enough for me." Tears welled up in Bram's old, weathered eyes. He could not bring himself to say another word. He simply sat by her side in silence until she had finished her meager meal. A few days passed. A strange man appeared at the entrance of the village. He was a man dressed in fine velvet and wool, wearing polished leather boots rather than worn peasant shoes. His name was Oswald, a greedy merchant guildmaster who dealt in medicinal herbs from the great capital city. Oswald unpacked his belongings in the grand manor hall of Giles, a wealthy and corrupt local landowner. For a long time, Oswald and Giles sat by the hearth, speaking in hushed, conspiratorial whispers. The next morning, at dawn, when Hazel stepped out of her cottage to climb the mountain, she froze. Her carefully tended herb garden had been ruthlessly trampled. The young angelica shoots were crushed into the mud, and the fully grown milk vetch roots had been violently ripped from the earth. Who would do such a thing? Hazel's knees gave out, and she sank to the ground. Just then, Oswald came strolling down the mountain path, carrying himself with incredible arrogance. My, good woman. It seems your little weed patch has been completely ruined. What a pity." Hazel asked, her voice trembling. "Was it you?" "Do you have proof?" Oswald scoffed. "Who knows? Perhaps a wild boar came down and trampled it. Regardless, you will have to buy your herbs from me now. I shall sell them to you cheap, just a few silver shillings a pound." Oswald laughed mockingly and continued down the mountain. Hazel sat before her ruined garden for a long time, yet she did not shed a single tear. That evening, Bram came to visit again, bringing food. When he saw Hazel's devastated herb garden, a dark, dangerous fury settled over his face. He was an old man, well past his prime, but the look in his eyes was still that of a lethal castle guard. "Milady, I will take my blade and gut that man."
"Bram, calm yourself," Hazel interrupted, stopping him.
She reached into the muddy, trampled earth and pulled up a single surviving stem of wild grass. "Look here, Bram. People merely call this a weed, but if you dry it properly and steep it, it becomes a precious medicine that clears the lungs of sickness." Bram blinked, his anger pausing. Hazel offered a gentle smile. There is no such thing as a useless plant in this world. People only call them weeds because they do not understand their purpose.
Even if they trample this small patch, the entire mountain is my garden. We have nothing to fear." At those words, Bram quietly nodded his head. He then held out the warm food he had brought. The two of them sat before the ruined garden, sharing their humble meal, blowing on the hot food and sharing soft laughter. But Oswald's wicked plot did not end there. A few days later, a horrific event struck the village. Agnes, an old servant belonging to Giles' household, suddenly vomited blood and collapsed on the floor. The village healer rushed to her side, but Agnes had already drawn her last breath. And there, lying right beside her lifeless body, was a sealed parchment pouch of herbs, the very same medicine Hazel had sent to her days ago. Hazel poisoned Agnes! Giles collapsed in his courtyard, beating his chest and wailing loudly for all to hear. Oswald stood beside him, pretending to wipe away tears, while a sinister smirk crept across his face. In truth, Giles had conspired with Oswald. They had secretly fed the old woman a deadly poison themselves. Everything was a vile trap designed to ensnare Hazel. The village folk, armed with torches and pitchforks, swarmed up the mountain to Hazel's cottage. "You murderer! You wicked witch!" These were the very same people who just days prior had drunk her medicine and survived the plague. But now they were consumed by blind terror. The sight of Agnes's poisoned corpse had left nothing but fear in their minds. Hazel did not resist. Even as thick hemp ropes were bound tightly around her wrists and she was dragged away, she merely kept her head bowed in silence. From a distance, Bram watched the scene unfold, his fists trembling with rage. But catching a stern, warning glance from Hazel, Bram forced himself to stay hidden in the shadows. Hazel was thrown into the cold stone dungeon beneath the sheriff's court. Guy, the sheriff's deputy, interrogated her fiercely, but Hazel offered no desperate excuses. "The herbs I sent to Agnes were only meant to soothe her cough. There was no poison in them." "Then how do you explain her death?" Guy demanded. "That I do not know, but the truth will reveal itself in time." Guy beat his chest in sheer frustration. Hazel languished in the freezing, damp cell for days. Knowing that Oswald had likely bribed the manor guards, she feared the food was laced with poison and ate almost nothing. Outside the dungeon walls, Bram roamed the village and the mountain like a madman, desperately searching for a way to save her. But while Bram searched, Oswald was setting an even darker scheme into motion. Oswald's true master was not himself. He answered to a far more dangerous man in the capital, Mortimer, a deeply corrupt and powerful High Lord of the realm, the very man responsible for the death of Hazel's father. Oswald was nothing more than a hound unleashed by Mortimer. On the deep,
pitch-black night of her 6th day in captivity, 2 guards dragged Hazel from her cell. Waiting for them were 3 hired assassins, sent by Mortimer and led by a cutthroat named Pike. Together with the corrupt guards, they dragged Hazel deep into the darkest, most treacherous part of the mountain woods. Their destination was a sheer 1,000-foot drop located miles away from the village. Say the witch lost her footing and fell to her death. The wolves of the forest will take care of the corpse. Pike tossed a heavy pouch of silver coins to the corrupt guards. The guards eagerly snatched the silver and slinked away into the shadows, leaving the deadly task to the assassins. Pike and his men began to force Hazel toward the very edge of the sheer drop. "As long as you draw breath, Lord Mortimer cannot rest easy," Pike sneered. "So do us all a favor and fall quietly." Hazel stood at the edge of the abyss and slowly closed her eyes. The bitter memories of 15 years ago washed over her. She remembered the blood of her father and the dark dawn when she fled the royal castle, escaping the capital on the broad back of his loyal guard. Hazel softly whispered into the freezing wind, telling herself that this must be where her journey finally ends. But in that exact moment, a sharp, piercing whistle cut through the pitch-black woods. The assassins jumped in surprise and spun around. The sound of tumbling stones echoed from the tree line, causing one of the killers to stumble backward. From the deep shadows, an old man stepped forward. In his weathered hands, he held a gleaming longsword, its steel reflecting the pale moonlight. It was Bram. "Step away from Lady Hazel," Bram commanded. His voice was low, but it carried the chilling weight of cold iron. The assassins burst into cruel laughter, mocking the frail old woodcutter who dared to challenge them. But before their laughter could even fade, Bram moved. His longsword sliced through the night air with blinding speed. In one fluid motion, he struck the blade from the first assassin's grip, then twisted the wrist of the second, forcing him to drop his dagger to the dirt. It was the flawless, deadly footwork of a master knight, a skill impossible for a man well past his 70th winter. Terrified by this sudden display of lethal mastery, Pike and his remaining men turned and fled blindly into the dark forest. Bram immediately dropped his sword and fell to his knees at the edge of the cliff, pulling Hazel back from the brink and wrapping his arms around her. Her hands were as cold as winter ice. "My lady, we can no longer stay hidden," Bram said, his voice trembling with emotion. "We must ride for the royal court. We must bring the truth before King Edward." This time, Hazel did not refuse. She simply rested her exhausted head against the old woodcutter's stooped shoulder, finally ready to face the ghosts of her past. The harsh winter eventually melted away, giving way to a gentle spring. But within the grand stone walls of the royal castle, a heavy sorrow hung in the air. Queen Mother Eleanor had fallen gravely ill. For 15 long years, the Queen Mother had lived with a terrible, aching guilt in her heart. She had never forgiven herself for failing to protect the innocent royal physician and his daughter, who had been framed in her own court. On her deathbed, with her breaths growing shallow, Queen Mother Eleanor summoned her son, King Edward, to her side. "My son, I have but one final request," she whispered weakly. 15 years ago, the royal physician was murdered, and his brilliant daughter, Hazel, was falsely accused and driven from the castle. You must find her. You must clear her name. If she still lives, she will be hidden deep within the northern mountain woods. She was the one who diagnosed me when no one else could. I have lived my entire life never forgetting the warmth and kindness of her hands. With those final, heavy words, Queen Mother Eleanor closed her eyes and passed from this world. King Edward wept, carving his mother's dying wish deep into his soul. "Prepare the royal carriage at once," King Edward commanded his knights. "I shall ride out to the mountains and bring this woman back myself." And so the grand royal procession, with banners flying and armor gleaming, made its way up the rugged mountain trails until it reached the muddy market square of the remote village. The knights rode past the whispering townsfolk and halted before a humble, weather-beaten thatched cottage on the edge of the woods. There, King Edward finally found Hazel. Covered in dirt and holding a woven basket of wild roots, Hazel fell to her knees in the soil before the king. King Edward stepped down from his carriage and personally reached out to lift her to her feet. "Raise your head, Lady Hazel," the king said softly. At the sound of her true title, the tears Hazel had held back for 15 agonizing years began to stream down her face. King Edward spoke to her with deep reverence. "Queen Mother Eleanor asked for you before she took her final breath. She said she could never forget the warmth of your hands. Come with me to the royal court. I swear upon my crown that I will restore your family's honor." From a distance, the village folk watched this magnificent sight with their jaws dropped in absolute shock. This was the same woman they had mocked just days ago, calling her a crazy herb gatherer. And now, the king of the realm was bowing his head to her. Upon returning to the royal castle, Hazel stood before King Edward and revealed every dark secret of the past. She explained how Lord Mortimer had orchestrated her ruin 15 years ago. During a routine medical examination, Hazel's father had accidentally discovered proof of Mortimer's brother committing massive treason and stealing from the royal treasury. To silence them forever, Lord Mortimer had his men assassinate the royal physician, and then spun a web of lies to frame the innocent Hazel for the crime. Bram, who was her father's loyal guard at the time, had discovered the foul conspiracy. Knowing he could not fight the High Lord's power alone, Bram had smuggled Hazel out of the dungeons and vanished with her into the mountains. Furious, King Edward summoned Lord Mortimer to the great hall. At first, the arrogant High Lord fiercely denied the accusations, demanding proof. But then, Bram stepped forward from the shadows. The old woodcutter produced a bundle of sealed parchments and hidden ledgers he had guarded with his life for 15 years. As the undeniable evidence of treason and murder was laid bare, Lord Mortimer finally collapsed to his knees, begging for mercy. Swift justice followed. Oswald, the greedy merchant, and Giles, the corrupt landowner, were dragged in chains to the capital and quickly confessed to their wicked crimes in the village. The king's judgment was absolute. Lord Mortimer was stripped of his noble titles, his lands were seized by the crown, and he was banished to a desolate, freezing borderland for the rest of his miserable days. His entire household was reduced to common peasantry. As for Oswald and Giles, they were severely flogged in the public square and exiled to a barren, windswept rock in the sea. When the news reached the mountain village, the townsfolk celebrated in the taverns, cheering as if a dark cloud had finally been lifted from their lives. Yet, despite her absolute victory, Hazel did not wish to remain in the grand castle. When King Edward offered to establish her officially within the royal court, Hazel bowed deeply and politely declined. "My king, your grace is as vast as the sky," she said gently, "but I only wish to return to my quiet mountain home. I want to build a healing hall there, a place where I can teach young scholars and provide medicine for the poor and forgotten, just as my father would have wanted." Moved by her profound humility and noble spirit, King Edward gladly granted her request. He sent royal architects to the village to build a beautiful timber and stone healing hall. And he decreed that a wagon of rare medicines and silver coins would be sent to her every year from the royal treasury. 10 years quickly passed. The once isolated mountain village was no longer a lonely place. It was now a bustling haven, filled with eager young men and women who traveled from all corners of the realm to learn the art of medicine. In the grand courtyard of the healing hall stood a beautiful, ancient apple tree. Beneath its blooming branches, Master Healer Hazel was instructing her students. "Look closely at this leaf," she told them, holding up a simple green stem. "Most folks call this a useless weed and trample it underfoot. But if you dry it properly and brew it into a tea, it can calm a violent cough and break a deadly fever." Hazel's hair was now streaked with silver, but her hands were just as warm and steady as they had always been. Her students watched her every movement with deep respect. "There is no such thing as a useless weed in this world," Hazel continued, her voice full of warmth. "In the eyes of our Lord in heaven, a soul of a lowly beggar is just as precious as a king upon his throne. Every weed has its medicine, and every man has his place in God's grand design." Standing quietly by the courtyard gate was old man Bram, leaning heavily on a wooden walking stick. Now well past his 80th year, Bram no longer carried a longsword. He was simply the humble gatekeeper of the healing hall. His days were spent sweeping the stone paths and keeping the hearth fires burning bright. To anyone else, it might have seemed like a lowly life for a former royal guard, but to Bram, it was the greatest happiness he had ever known. It happened on a gentle spring evening. Bram was sitting on a wooden bench beneath the blooming apple tree, watching the white petals drift lazily in the wind. Hazel walked out of the hall, carrying a warm cup of herbal tea, and sat beside her oldest friend. "How do you fare today, my dear friend?" she asked softly. "I think I am finally a bit tired, my lady," Bram replied, his voice thin and trembling. Hazel gently took the old man's hand. The hand that had been as cold as ice on the cliff edge 15 years ago was now warm and peaceful. "I will never forget the grace you showed me, Bram," Hazel whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You gave up your entire life to hide me in the mountains. I will carry that debt for the rest of my days." "A debt?" Bram smiled weakly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I only did what any good man should do, my lady. A soft gust of wind blew through the courtyard, sending a shower of white apple blossoms falling like snow upon Bram's silver hair. Still sitting on the wooden bench, the old woodcutter slowly closed his eyes. He looked as though he were simply drifting off into a deep, peaceful sleep. Hazel sat in the quiet twilight for a very long time, holding his hand. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but a beautiful, grateful smile rested on her lips. "Rest well, my brave knight," Hazel whispered into the wind. "In the next life, you shall be the master, and I will be the one to protect you." Bram passed away peacefully beneath the apple tree he loved so much. Every student in the healing hall gathered to honor the old gatekeeper, carrying him to his final rest with the utmost respect. They buried Bram in the sacred, consecrated ground of the local parish churchyard, and Hazel planted a young apple sapling right beside his grave to honor his memory. On a bright morning, when the apple blossoms were in full bloom once again, Hazel walked into the churchyard and sat by Bram's grave. She placed a fresh, warm oatcake on the stone marker, just the way he always liked them. "Eat this while it is warm, my friend," she said with a fond smile. A gentle breeze swept across the churchyard, and the delicate leaves of the young apple sapling danced in the air, almost as if Bram were waving back at her. Hazel stood up, her heart feeling light and full of peace. She turned and walked back down the path toward the healing hall. There were sick people waiting to be cured and eager students waiting to be taught. And so ends the tale of Hazel, the hidden herbalist, and Bram, the loyal old guard. What did you think of their journey? They say that a heart devoted to saving others never truly grows old. Because Hazel kept her pure heart through 15 years of bitter hardship, she finally saw the glorious light of truth. And because old Bram sacrificed everything to walk the righteous path, he was granted the most peaceful rest. Just as there is no such thing as a useless weed in the forest, every single person in this world has their own precious, hidden purpose. Do you have someone like Bram in your life? Someone who stands by your side in total silence, always ready to reach out and pull you back from the edge of despair? Perhaps today is the perfect day to offer them a warm word of gratitude. After all, a heart that loves and saves others will never fade away. I will return next time with another beautiful, heartwarming tale from the days of old. May you all stay healthy and have a truly peaceful night.